Hello, everyone. I'm Margarita Pinton Perez, and I'm the Community Partnership Leader with the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, welcome to our co-hosted special event, Elder Abuse in the Canadian LGBTQ2SA Community, Qualitative and Quantitative Findings. Joining me today from Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario is Rayanne Rideout. Rayanne Rideout is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and has collaborated with the Learning Network for many years on initiatives related to the prevention of gender-based violence among older adults. We would like to start this presentation with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenampewak, and Chungtinn nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with a responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As the Learning Network is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end the spectrum of gender-based violence, we also recognize that today, these nations face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2SL LGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms that shape the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities. We commit to furthering our work in ways that best uphold solidarity with Indigenous survivors and those supporting them. I now welcome Rayanne, who will join us now in introducing our speakers.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're thrilled today to be joined today for our session by Dr. Gloria Gutman and Dr. Claire Robson. Dr. Gutman is a professor and director of Emerita at the Simon Fraser University Gerontology Research Center and Gerontology Department. Dr. Gutman's current research and advocacy is focused on elder abuse in marginalized groups and ethnic minorities. She's joined by her colleague, Dr. Claire Robson, who is an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University and is a writer and lead researcher on the Indigo Project, a collaboration between Simon Fraser University and Q Community BC's Resource Center for 2S LGBTQA+ peoples. You can find their full bios and link that's been shared in the webinar chat, and as well as on the our websites prior to the event being posted. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Claire to begin the presentation. I look forward to learning a lot more about the research that you have been doing. And it gives me pleasure to collaborate with Gloria again because we've been long friends in the work that she's been doing around elder abuse prevention. So Claire, I'll turn it over to you.
Greetings, everybody. Gloria and I are delighted to be here, and we join you from Vancouver, the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. Well, as you see, this was a partnership between the research team situated at Simon Fraser University Myself and Jen Marchbank are both in gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Simon Fraser. And as you can see from the taglines, also lifetime activists within the LGBTQ2SA+ community here in the Lower Mainland. We were joined by Gloria Gutman, who needs no introduction to most of you, I'm sure. Gloria has contributed from the field of gerontology to the elder abuse literature in many ways over the years. And our fourth team member was our research assistant, Makaela Prentice. It was an innovative partnership. We teamed up with Community. I don't know if you can read the small type, but Community is a province-wide organization that provides support and resources for queer, trans, and two-spirit people across the province of British Columbia. And we partnered there with Courtney Diekbrada, who is the seniors programmer at Community, and a very experienced trauma counselor, Devon Christian. We provided free trauma counseling for anybody who wanted it in terms of our participants. So let's move on to some definitions. What counts as elder and what counts as abuse? We're drawing here on the fairly traditional definitions, those presented by the National Institute for Care for the Elderly. They define elder as 55 plus. All of our participants were actually over the age of 60, 65. And the types of abuse we covered are physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and sexual. And finally, neglect, the absence of the provision of suitable care. Moving on to some queer terminology, which can be daunting for mainstream audiences. Cisgender simply means that your body matches the gender identity you were assigned at birth. A transgender person is an individual who identifies as being a different gender from the one assigned. And they may or may not have had gender-affirming surgery. In the case of older adults who come out as trans later in life, it is less likely that they may have had such surgery. Heteronormativity is the assumption that all persons are heterosexual, and cis heteronormativity, the assumption that all persons are cisgender and heterosexual. In the text of the book that was the main outcome of this project, we use the acronym GSM for gender and sexual minorities. It's easier, it's less intimidating for mainstream audiences, and it's an umbrella term that we feel covers most of the identifications, though it does tend to obscure them, certainly. We used the acronym in the title of the book because our publisher wanted searchable terms. But the issue with the lengthy queer alphabet, of course, is that it's extremely political. It changes to reflect cultural changes and can become quickly out of date. So why did we need this project? The current research shows, data-driven research, that queer elders are more likely to live alone, they're more likely to be depressed or suffer from mental illnesses, they're more likely to have one or more disabilities, they're less likely to have contact with their family of origin. If we have kids, which is less likely, we may not have contact with them. The elder queers, such as myself, I identify as lesbian and I'm 75. were more likely to have experienced trauma such as sexual assault, incest, rape, violence, and abuse in our early years. And we are more likely to have self-medicated through the use of drugs and alcohol. And all these, of course, are risk factors for elder abuse. So as we started with some early projects on elder abuse, we realized that though we have the risk factors in spades, you might say, nothing really had been written about elder abuse in the GSM population. And certainly hardly anybody, in fact, nobody really had talked to survivors. A central plank, theoretically, for us is drawn from the disability community, who have said for decades that nothing should be written about them without their voices. And in that spirit, I want to start by sharing just one of the stories of the 9 participants that we worked with. Trudy is a transsexual woman. She was 70 plus at the time the abuse occurred that we report on. And she suffers from ME, commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome in her later years. When she was just a small kid, her parents said, well, we knew you were different when you were 2 years old because we teach you how to throw and you always threw like a girl. We tried to beat it out of you. Given this cultural context, Trudy indeed experienced an early sense of difference. She attempted suicide at the age of 6. She stockpiled bottles of iodine in a vacant lot next to her house. And at the age of 6, she swallowed 2 of the bottles. Of course, all it did was turn her mouth yellow and get another licking from her mom. She started to go to gay bars at the age of 14, not to drink, drug, dance, or do anything really except nurse a bottle of Coke and just watch people come in because she felt that she was not alone. She felt that these were her people. Though she didn't abuse drugs or alcohol, she was arrested. She was taken to the local mental institution where she was subject to weekly conversion therapy at the hands of a Dr. Freud type, as she described him, where he ridiculed the size of her penis and just told her to act more butch. In her 20s, she survived this. She became a teacher, and in her late 20s decided to undergo gender-affirming surgery. Wasn't legal in Canada. She took a bus to New York City, where a shady doctor, as she described him, took her money, forgot about doing any medical tests, gave her the surgery. She went back to Montreal, where she was alone in a small apartment. In the heat of the summer, she got an infection. Her friends deserted her, and she said this was the rock bottom for her. She survived that, and now is in her 70s. She needs in-home care support, and mainly for showering to make sure she keeps her balance. One care worker ignored her completely, sat on her phone, and refused to do any care or to come near Trudy. When Trudy complained, the caregiver immediately called the head office and said that Trudy was abusing her. Another in-home care provider showed a sort of unholy interest in Trudy's physical body. And when she came out of the shower, she rushed at Trudy with a towel and insisted on drying her genital area, despite Trudy's protests. and despite several complaints to administration. If there's one thing I would like you to take away from this presentation, it's the impact, the historical impact upon older queers such as myself through systemic cultural violence, which is not always overt. We lived through a time when being gay was criminalized and pathologized. Many of us, myself included, lived in the closet. Because we couldn't marry, our financial arrangements were often informal. We didn't have legal protections under the law, and we experienced constant slights and psychic wounding, and we still do. When I come out, say, to people in my golf club, they ask me two questions. What was it like when you were a kid? And it's better now, isn't it? And the answer, of course, is yes and no, as I think you shall see. To complicate matters, we were not counted in the census. Gender identity was added only in 2023, and we have not typically been identified as needing special services. All these factors make us more likely to tolerate and accept high levels of abuse. It's almost like, I would say, a form of grooming in the way that we've been inured to these psychic slights on a lifelong basis. One of our participants actually put it better than I probably can. Grace said, homophobic and transphobic prejudice and hate assaults the most profound levels of being, impeding healthy emotional development and maturation, the capacity for rewarding wholesome relationships with oneself and others, and generates destructive forces within the person who can no longer connect with the deepest gift of life, the truth and beauty of our own being. Added to this is the fact that our relationship with healthcare professionals has been extremely troubled. Every single participant mentioned the AIDS epidemic, for example, and how we were sidelined and marginalized by healthcare professionals. And this has left us with a deep distrust of medical institutions. Sadly, the current research shows that doctors, nurses, and elder care providers still exhibit not just ignorance, but outright homophobia and transphobia. So it's not surprising that we're less likely to visit doctors, and when we do, we're less likely to come out as queer or trans. So moving on to the project itself, we had 9 participants, and they included 2 trans women, 2 gay men, and 5 lesbians. We also interviewed the senior specialist from Community. She deals with phone calls from elders on almost a daily basis. She reporting abuse and neglect of some kind, and often is unable to find services to recommend. And we also experienced interviewed Devon Christian, who is, as I said, an experienced trauma counselor, and she had much to say about the importance of providing mental health supports for participants. So what we did, I conducted at least 2 interviews with all 9 participants. I did all the interviews myself for several reasons. One, so that there was continuity across the interviews, and secondly, for reasons of confidentiality. All 9 participants were really quite terrified. It was very hard to get people to come forward. I want to acknowledge their courage in coming forward and the extreme bravery in having these such delicate and revealing narratives published across the globe by an international publisher. Two of them tried to pull out actually before publication. It was extremely challenging. They were frightened of lawsuits and of personal recrimination. Several received one-on-one support, which was freely offered from the therapist, and 4 of them actually met in a peer support group, which was so valuable that community found extra funding to continue the work after the end of the project. I then worked with the narrators to turn their interview transcripts into typed first-person narratives. I had them transcribed online using Otter, and then I turned them, I edited them down. I added no words of my own, but I took out many words. I took out repetitions. I organized the narratives chronologically, and then I shared each narrative with the participant and conducted at least 1, often 2 or 3 interviews as we went line by line through the narratives until they were entirely happy that they reflected their stories. We published these as a book, together with a literature review, a methodology chapter, some discussion, a historical chapter that talked about the experiences, the cultural context, and of course some recommendations for practitioners. Here's our book. Unfortunately, it's rather expensive. It's just the way of the publishing world. The good news is that you can download online version, and you can also download each chapter on its own. It's a much cheaper way to do it. You can download any of the narratives or the methodology or the lit review or the historical material. These are the contexts of the abuse and the types of abuse covered in the study. Of course, we can't draw broad conclusions from 9 participants. It rather represents a deep dive into the narrative. Turn to Gloria in the second presentation for the more quantitative data. And it's, I think, very useful that Gloria and I come from, the quantitative, qualitative fields. You get a good overview here. So our participants were abused by in-home care providers. They were abused by religious institutions. We do recommend that religious abuse be added. It's of particular relevance, I think, to the queer population. In residential care and within romantic relationships, as we look at partner abuse and domestic violence. And interestingly, within the lesbian community, as people who identify as gender, sexual, and minority people, we tend to want to protect our community. We tend to want to tell celebratory narratives. It's one thing to tell your family that you're lesbian, quite another to admit that abuse is happening within that relationship. And one of our participants talked quite tellingly about the sideways hostility that exists within the lesbian community. So moving on then to our findings. All of our participants talk about a strong sense of difference and dislocation from early childhood. All were abused in early childhood, actually. And as one of them said, this put a target on their backs. Of course, there's a chicken and egg situation here, which has been reflected in the research. And some researchers have argued that because gender and sexual minority people have been abused in childhood, this is what turns them queer, as you might say. But of course, more recent research reverses that situation and says that because queer people experience this sense of difference, it puts a target on their backs that abusers and perpetrators are able to hone in on any individual who feels a sense of difference. And at the same time, of course, they did not have the mentorship and the family support that might have helped them navigate this situation. One researcher, Cale Reed, has talked about how it takes a village to raise a child and how we didn't have that village. We didn't have photographs of queer elders. We didn't have that support. So we turned elsewhere to find that. One of our participants said that his mentors were the older men that he had sex with when he was young. And, you know, we have to broaden our hearts and minds in some ways to see that support doesn't always look like we expect it to. Trudy going to gay bars would be another example. There are some similarities with mainstream abuse, many similarities. So in residential care, abuse can look very much the same. Staff shortages, nurses overworked and turning the reins, the cultural reins, if you like, to low-paid support staff who may not have cultural competency in queer situations. Abuse and neglect by inadequately trained in-home care staff. And the financial and emotional abuse in partnerships looked again very similar, escalating slowly, and the slow isolation from friends and supports by romantic partners. Moving on to the difference, as I said, the main one is the cultural violence. Early abuse increases vulnerability for this generation of GSM elders, historic homophobia in the healthcare system, failure to provide informed, effective, and appropriate care for queer and particularly for trans clients. Unchecked homophobic attitudes and comments was a big one, and I'll return to this in the next slide. Rejection and stigmatization by faith communities. What we found is that homophobia and transphobia exist really on a spectrum. On one end, you do have overt homophobia and transphobia. But in North America, at least, in the 21st century, it's unlikely that someone will say, well, I'm doing this because you're a lesbian or because you're trans, because we have legal, legal protections in place. What is much more likely is that there is covert homophobia and transphobia. Many of our participants said, you know, I have all these tattoos. When the cops drove up, they didn't get out of their car. They just wound their window down and talked to me out of their car window. I could feel the homophobia. But of course, you cannot pin it down. Moving towards the other end of the spectrum, just an assumption of cis heteronormativity. I lost my partner to breast cancer 5 years ago, spent a lot of time at the BC Cancer Agency, and I encountered this every time I went. And on the far end of the spectrum is internalized homophobia, a lesbian widow who doesn't tell her caregivers that her partner died recently. All the signs were there, photographs on the mantelpiece, the partner's clothes still in the closet, but because she couldn't speak to it, it was never recognized. Our recommendations then are that service providers should not assume cis heteronormativity, nor should they assume that their clients wish to disclose. Some elderly, queer and trans people may wish not to be outed. That said, intake procedures should allow for disclosure if desired through neutral questions such as who have been your romantic partners, men, women, or both. There should be dedicated means of reporting abuse for GSM people, and very importantly, queer competency training for all, particularly for on-the-ground staff. And this should be ongoing because there's a revolving door, of course, as we all know, of support staff. There should be awareness of the complex history of gender, sexual, and minority people. Signage is good, rainbow flags, mission statements are good, safe space indicators are good, but more than that, themed events, pride celebrations and breakfast, speakers, gender and sexual minority films, books, inclusive language, and importantly, zero tolerance of homo and transphobic behavior, such as jokes. Increased availability of affordable counseling and supports for survivors, and of course, further research, both qualitative and quantitative, including the populations, including Indigenous people, including gender and sexual minorities. Here's our book, a couple of key resources. I know these resources will be shared, and I would like to thank our hosts here for including us. If you have questions, I'll be more than happy to answer these in the Q&A. Thanks very much for listening.
Well, it's my turn now, and I see, Claire, your picture is still up, and my video, I don't see, on my screen, I don't see myself, even though I did click on video.
Your video is showing, Gloria.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
The project that you've just heard about was a really interesting one in which we did in-depth interviews with a small number of people. But I'm one of those who always asks the question, how many are we talking about? Because I've learned over the years that if you're going to have any impact on policy and on programs and stuff in the real world, you really, really need to have some numbers to support it. So next slide, please. I work with 3 different research teams on research that's related to elder abuse and or to the LGBT community. The particular persons that I worked with on the project I'm going to talk about today were Mojan Karbash and Heather Stewart. Next slide. And our data particularly came from the Canadian Study of Health and Aging. the Canadian longitudinal study is is what it's technically called. But before we get there, I just want to go over a couple of key points. Internationally, 5 types of abuse are recognized. In British Columbia, they also recognize self-neglect, but internationally, it's those 5. We also want to note that elder abuse occurs in multiple settings, in the community and across the range of institutional settings, including hospitals and long-term care and assisted living. Of the various types, psychological and financial are the most common. And what we're realizing is that many victims will experience more than one type, either at the same time or sequentially. So someone who is financially abused often will also be psychologically abused. And that's some of the power that is involved. Power differences need to be recognized. Next slide. So as Claire has said, lesbian, gay, and bisexual older adults have long experienced trauma. They've experienced isolation, stigma, and discrimination. They're less likely to have to be partnered, and if they have children, to have children who are supportive of them, which makes them potentially more vulnerable than other people, other older adults, to the typical elder abuse, as well as to unique forms. And, you know, amongst the kinds of unique forms are the threats of outing the person if they have not publicly told people that they are part of the LGBT community. Next slide. What our objectives in this study was to give some numbers to estimate the prevalence of the 3 different types of elder abuse in both the heterosexual and the lesbian, gay, and bisexual Canadian older adult community, and to look at the profile of perpetrators. We were only able to look at 3 types of abuse because that was the only, they were the only ones that were included in the Canadian longitudinal study of aging. So we only looked at psychological, physical, and financial. And in terms of the characteristics of perpetrators, the only things that we were given information about was the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, the sex of the perpetrator, and whether or not they lived with the victim. Next slide. So in terms of research questions, what we wanted to know was, do the rates for psychological, financial, and physical abuse differ when we look at survivors' sexual orientation and gender identity? And you will note that I'm changing the words from talking about victims to talking about survivors, because the people who responded to the questions in the Canadian study of health and age, the longitudinal study on aging, were in fact survivors. And it recognizes their strength and in coping with difficult situations. We also wanted to know, were the profiles of the perpetrators different if we look at the different abuse types? And do they look different when we look within the groups to see if people who are abused, who are heterosexual, men or women, are abused by the same types of individuals, i.e. this having the same kinds of relationships. Next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, it's a national treasure. It's a study of over 50,000 Canadians aged 45 to 85 when the study started, which was back in 2012 to 2015. Follow-ups are conducted every 3 years, and they will be conducted for at least 20 years until 2033, or the participants pass away or lost to follow-up. So what we did was to analyze data for people who were aged 65 and over at follow-up. And the elder abuse module was only asked of people who were 65 and over, and it only didn't occur in the first round. It did occur in the follow-up one. And those people that did complete this module had to be, or who actually took part in the CLSA, had to be physically and cognitively able to participate on their own. So this is people who were not cognitively impaired at the time that they entered the study, and they were able to communicate in English or French. So when we, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the limitations, meaning that, not our full population, our multicultural population is represented in the CLSA, but it's a national treasure in the sense of having a large number of Canadian adults that are being followed over time. And that allows us to ask some questions that you can't do when you're just doing a cross-sectional point in time kind of study. Next slide. The elder abuse module was adapted from work by the National Initiative for Care of the Elderly. The conceptual definitions were developed in a pilot study. We had some estimates of the number of Canadian older adults who experienced mistreatment that were reported in 2015 and by McDonald. And the module includes 4 questions on psychological abuse, 6 questions on physical abuse, and 3 on financial abuse. And the way we dealt with them was to construct some variables for each of the types. It was a yes or no, a 1 or 2. Did you or did you not experience? So if we could have the next slide, I'll show you the actual questions. In the case of psychological abuse, the questions had to do with over the past 12 months. Did anybody criticize you? And if so, how often did it happen? Who did it? Was this person male or female? Did that person or any of those persons live with you? So the questions, the 4 questions all have a time frame within the last 12 months, all ask who did it and how often. But the key things in psychological were, has anybody criticized you? Has anybody insulted you? Has anybody threatened or intimidated you, or excluded you or ignored you? Some of those kinds of questions are things that all of us experience on, and so in the case of psychological abuse, it was counted as abuse if it occurred many times or every day. So it wasn't just a one-off that somebody made a nasty remark to you, rather, but this was something that was, more chronic. On the other hand, in the case of threats or intimidation, once was deemed to be enough to count as being abused. Next slide. this shows you the questions that were asked about physical abuse. Did anybody push or shove or grab you? Did anybody throw something at you? Did anybody hit or slap you? Did anybody try to choke you with something? Did anybody threaten you with a weapon? These are serious kinds of things. And again, in this case, it's quite clear, you know, if it happened once, it was something to be considered and taken seriously. Next slide. This shows you financial abuse questions, which were, did anybody make you give them your money, your possessions or property? Did somebody take money, possessions or property from you? Has anybody prevented your access to your money, possessions or property? And you know, it's very interesting because recently I got a call from a person that works in the field, healthcare field, and they were very concerned about an individual who had a wealth manager. And I'd been with this wealth manager for many years, but every time they asked this wealth manager, I want to give some money to a particular charity and so on, they got stalled, and the person was actually being victimized by a wealth manager. And so what I said to the person that asked me the question is, I said, you should go to that person's supervisor and say, something funny is going on here. You know, we really in this field need to speak up when we think that there is a problem, particularly if we're in a gatekeeper kind of situation or a position, and where we are able to at least speak up or have somebody who has the skills to work with abuse situations to ask if the person that is being victimized would like to have some help. Okay, next slide. What we found was that overall, about 10% of the respondents to the elder abuse module indicated that they had experienced one of the 3 types of abuse that we were looking at. But what leaped out and was really surprising to me was that overall, it was lesbian and bisexual women who had the highest rate of abuse. Next slide. When we started looking at the different types of abuse, what we found was, as in most other studies, the overall prevalence was highest for psychological abuse. But again, what leaped out was that it was the lesbian and bisexual women who were most likely to be victimized. Next slide. The prevalence of financial abuse, and as you'll see in a minute, of physical abuse was much less than psychological abuse. But again, we see this pattern of higher rates in lesbian and bisexual women. Next slide. But we've got a different pattern when it comes to physical abuse. And although the difference is not statistically significant, it is very noticeable that it's gay and bisexual men who are most likely to be physically abused. Next slide. When we start to look at the relationships, what we see is that the amongst people who are partnered or married, the perpetrator is most likely to be their spouse, with children also sometimes being the perpetrator, other family members, friends. But there's also quite a large number of, or large percentage, who reported somebody that was outside of the usual groups and relationships that we look at. And I'll have more information for you as we look at this pattern, which appears in the other types of fairly high number of others, not just the people that you would think about. Next slide. When we look at the sex of the perpetrator, what leaps out here, particularly with the spouse or partner, is that it's almost equal of the perpetrator being male or female. And work by Lysova from the criminology department at Simon Fraser University indicates that male spouse partner victimization is far more common than people realize. We tend to think that it's mostly the mostly that the perpetrator is male, which is overall true, but still there's a sizable number who are of males who are abused by a female perpetrator. And again, we see a substantial percentage of people in this other category. Next slide. In the case of the question of does the perpetrator live with the victim, what we see in this slide is where they are spouses or partners, as we would expect, the vast majority do live with one another. But what this slide also shows is that in the other category, for about a quarter of the people, the perpetrator doesn't live with them. It's somebody else. Next slide. When it comes to physical abuse, again, it's in married or people living in a partnership relationship. Most likely the abuser is the spouse or partner. And we have some in this other category again, in addition to siblings, kids, grandkids, and others. Next slide. And this slide shows the pattern again of that it's sometimes the perpetrator is male, sometimes the perpetrator is female. So we don't look only at males as being the ones that are going to victimize other people, but also recognize that some females may well be abusing their partners. Next slide. And this is the question of, do they live together? And in case of 44%, yes, they do. But again, down here in the other category, we've got a substantial number who don't live with the survivor. Next slide. And when it comes to financial abuse, what leaps out is the very large number of people who are being financially abused by other people, not just the traditional kinds of perpetrators that we've tended to look like. Next slide. So what do we know about these other perpetrators? Well, we analyzed some written in responses to the question of who took money, possessions, or property from you, or made you give money or possessions or property. And what leaps out are that some of these kinds of people are people that provide services. Like here, it was the hot water rental company that kept taking money out of her account where she had given them her credit card to prepay even after she moved. Somebody said it was a robber who broke into our house. Somebody else said an acquaintance. We've got a partner superintendents. In one case, that person was male. In another case, it was female. They talked about an ex-spouse. They talked about lawyers ripping them off. They talked about adopted child, aunt, brother. Somebody said a guy from the street, a guy from a bar, a panhandler. Another person said it was my tenant who ripped me off, or a neighbor or a work colleague. And one person said it was a stranger pretending to be from the Ministry of Transport. And then there was other people who talked about the bank, or we giggled a bit when we saw somebody said, well, it was the Canada Revenue Agency. And they said it was the government who was ripping us off. What also came out clear is that a number of people had been victimized by internet scam or false advertising on the internet, or somebody who was phoning them. And so, you know, we really, really, really have to look out and think about cybercrime as, because seniors are trusting people. And some of them are not very techno savvy, others are pretty good, and still can be fished in by the perpetrators who are getting to be more and more sophisticated in how they rip us off. So that's something that came forward in this study that tells us that in addition to looking at the kinds of people who are in a trust relationship, which is part of the definition of elder abuse, and that distinguishes it from crime and some of the things that can be considered and as criminal justice issues, but that we really need to be broader, because real people out there who are answering our questions are looking not just at their relatives or at their spouse or at somebody else that they know as a perpetrator, but also recognizing that there are other people out there that they feel are victimizing them. Next slide. So in the case of financial abuse, when we look at this, we see that the vast majority in that other category are males. Next slide. We see that the vast majority, in the case of financial abuse, don't live with the victim. Next slide. And when we look at the abuse types by SOGI, by the social, sexual orientation, gender identity of the survivor, what we see are some somewhat different patterns, which is quite interesting. So looking at psychological abuse, what we see is that for lesbian and bisexual women, it's their sibling or another family member who is most likely to be psychologically abusing them. In the case of gay or bisexual men, it's people in that other category. And on the other hand, with heterosexual men and women, it's most likely to be their partner. So the pattern of who the perpetrator is in psychological abuse, we see quite clearly, is different depending on the sexual or gender identity of the survivor. This is new stuff. This is hot data that we didn't have before. Next slide. And again, what we see here when we're looking at males or females, in the case of our lesbian or bisexual women, and it says other family members, it's other family members who are male that are victimizing them in a psychological way. And here we see, in terms of siblings, it's females who are, it's their sisters. And so the patterns are somewhat different depending on the SOGI of the survivor. And you'll see I'm using, in my earlier presentations, I've used the word victim, I used the word survivor, again, to emphasize that these people who we were talking to, or who filled out the, completed the elder abuse module in the CLSA, were survivors and who were talking about their own experiences in the Canadian context. Next slide. What we see here is the people, like the red lines, the red bars are those who did live with them, and it's a pattern is different for heterosexual men, heterosexual women, than it is for our gay men or lesbian women. Next slide. So we see a number of different kinds of patterns when it comes to physical abuse. In the case of gay or bisexual men, it seems to be that they're getting physically abused by others, not necessarily by their partner. In the case of lesbian and bisexual women, to some extent it's others, but it's also family members. Next. So there's a lot of detail in the kinds of analysis that we did. So I will just move a little more quickly now. If you could just give us the next slide or two. And we'll go on to the summary slides. But I just wanted you to see that, the analysis has been very detailed. Next slide. So, but when all is said and done, as with other studies, psychological abuse was most common, experienced by 9% of the sample. The rates for physical and financial was small, 1.3%. The lesbian, bisexual women were more likely than people in the other groups to have experienced psychological and financial abuse. On the other hand, it was the gay men who were most likely to experience physical abuse. Next slide. In terms of perpetrator relationships, psychological and physical abuse, the perpetrator most commonly was a spouse or a partner, followed by a child or a friend, whereas in the case of financial abuse, it was most commonly other. Next slide. And psychological and physical abuse were most commonly perpetrated by somebody who lived with the victim. Financial abuse, on the other hand, was most often perpetrated by a male who didn't live with the victim. And so these patterns do differ amongst SOGI groups. So in terms of services, we need to take these kinds of things into consideration. Next slide. Next slide. So we need to recognize that risk and protective factors differ for different living arrangements and abuse types, as well as by SOGI. And, we heard the slogan, safer at home, used to promote people staying at home during COVID-19. But the potential for violence spikes when you've got people who are spending 24/7 isolated at home with their abuser. And what we saw was, in some cases, children coming to live with their parent during COVID. And in the case of an older adult, the abuser can be a spouse or same-sex partner, can be a child, it can be other relatives, it could be a hired, or paid, or even a volunteer caregiver. But while living alone may be protective for physical abuse, see, if you're living alone, you're not going, you don't have somebody underfoot or with you 24 hours a day who might psychologically or physically or financially rip you off. But a risk factor for financial abuse, for frauds and scams, is living alone. We also need to remember that researchers and lay people's definitions of abuse vary. So what real people consider as abuse is a broader set of behaviors than traditionally we ask about in elder abuse studies. Next slide. And, we also want to raise the question of, what's ageism, what's discrimination, and what's abuse. And one of the people that was a respondent in the Canadian longitudinal study on aging talked about being dismissed as a patient by his family doctor, and talked about somebody calling them childish because she didn't sign, or he didn't sign in on his cell phone, and feeling hurt. But is this abuse, or is this ageism, or is this garden variety discrimination? So we need to think a bit more about something that individual Canadians consider to be abuse. Next slide. Now, in terms of limitations of the data that I had to work with, we need to note that the elder abuse module, unfortunately, was collected not at baseline, but only at follow-up 1, and it was not repeated in follow-up 2, but is being collected in follow-up 3. Follow-up 2, for some reason that I'm not totally aware of, instead of repeating the elder abuse module, they introduced one on intimate partner violence. So we will have a 6-year interval between the original data collection at follow-up 1 and the collection at follow-up 3. So that's 6 years is a long time. On the other hand, we've never before had as large a sample as we have that will be able to see if people who were victimized at one point in time, but not at another, like in follow-up 1, subsequently 6 years later, tell us that they have been victimized. And, the elder abuse data in this particular study asks about the frequency of abuse in the past 12 months. So we don't know much about the prior abuse history from that particular data set, but from other research that we're doing, there is reason to believe that some of the people, as Claire said, particularly in the LGBT community, may have been victimized and experienced homophobia or transphobia in earlier days or earlier phases of their life. And again, the question is, did their experience of homophobia or transphobia make them more likely to be a victim later on? So those are questions that still remain to be answered. And not all people who are victimized as children grow up to be a part of the gay community. Similarly, not all people in the gay community, as over their lifespan, become victims of elder abuse. Next slide. We also would like to be able to look at other factors, and in other studies, we would certainly recommend that people look at health status, social support. We will try to look at those variables in other studies that we can conduct, and to look more at these open text responses that indicate people who are don't meet the usual criterion of being a perpetrator. Next slide. So this is where you can find me. And if you want further information on CLSA, please visit the URL that's shown here. Thank you. This has been one of the most interesting kinds of studies that I've done in a long time, and I like to do mixed methods. I like the in-depth kinds of things that we did. That Claire and Jan Marchbank and I did with the Indigo Project, as well as asking those number questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Claire Robson and Dr. Gloria Gutman, for that thorough presentation on elder abuse within the Canadian LGBTQ2SA+ community. We really appreciate the time and the effort that you've put into this important research, and we're really grateful for your willingness to share your findings with us today. And just a friendly reminder that the recording and materials, such as the speaker's slides, will be emailed to you after the event. So we're now moving into the Q&A session. We have approximately 15 minutes. I encourage everyone to continue submitting their questions in the Zoom Q&A box. And I'll be now joined again by Rayanne from Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. And together we will address as many questions that you've submitted to the speakers as much as time allows. So let's start. So one of our participants shared, I can see you were not able to interview bisexual plus elders, which is a shame, but I know how difficult it is for our elders to talk about these things. Our research found unique experiences of bisexual older people. Do you have any comments on this from your work? For example, significant pressure for bisexual people to pick a side, leading to more isolation, less likely than other queer people to come out, etc.?
Claire?
I would say, speaking from my own experience, yes. The participants that we had in the Indigo Project were, of course, just those people that we were able to find, and it was extremely difficult to find participants. But I do agree that from my own experience, bisexual people have typically been marginalized by lesbians, by gay men, by the queer population itself. But that's just my take on it from my life experience. But Gloria, we were all, I think, somewhat surprised to find that bisexual women are indeed more likely, according to your data, to have been abused.
Yeah, well, we had to make a choice, and there were a relatively small number of bisexual people, even though the CLSA is a large sample, relatively small number of bisexual people. And there were not enough of them that we could do a separate analysis, right? And so rather than discount their voices, we grouped them in with the gender that they chose to identify with. But recognizing that, yeah, bisexual individuals may well have different kinds of experiences. Similarly, you know, we have had very few trans people in the CLSA. So we could not do a separate analysis on trans people, and chose to group them with the group that they chose. So the sexual identity that they chose to identify with.
Thank you, Gloria and Claire, for that explanation. We have another question sort of building onto that database. Has the profile of this population and perpetrators changed since COVID and emerging from lockdown and the pandemic? I'm not sure if you can gather that from the longitudinal study, but maybe just based on your other research, Claire.
No, I wouldn't want to venture any answer on that. I mean, I think, you know, we all know the tremendous problems that COVID caused for people living in residential care and long-term care. And I think the point Gloria made about, you know, safer at home is very well taken.
Yeah, well, we did a separate analysis of the COVID-19 survey that was included with the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. I can send you the reference to that. The patterns are similar.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to share the next question. One of our participants asks, what signs of elder abuse should we be looking out for, specifically for queer elders who are in care?
That's a great question. And what comes to my mind is the story of a lesbian widow who was malnourished, you know, dog feces ground into the carpet. The neighbor had the bank card, but never provided any groceries. And it was interesting because they gave her a social worker, an older man, who was also Greek. This was a Greek woman. And of course, the social worker was the worst possible fit because this woman had been, her father, her Greek father had tried to forcibly marry her off to cure her of being a lesbian. Everything was invisible and everything was in plain sight, right? There were wedding pictures, pictures of her being on the cruise with her partner over many decades. The wife's clothes were still hanging in the closet. The woman's clothes didn't fit because she'd lost so much weight, but she was terrified of coming out. She didn't want to disclose. This is really a very hard balance to tread. When we did this presentation up in Prince George, I don't know if you remember, Gloria, but there was a woman that said she put a poster up about LGBTQ issues. I think it was a pride poster, and it was being ripped down every morning systematically. And the assumption was that this was somebody who was homophobic and transphobic, but it was the lesbian inhabitant of the home who was taking it down because she didn't want to draw people's attention to anything to do with queerness. So it's problematic. You know, when you ask, you know, what are the signs? The truth is that the signs might be very well hidden. And, you know, that's why we emphasize queer competence and training, because we can tend to hide from plain view very, very efficiently. I don't know if that answers the question. It's kind of a non-answer, but I think it's true. It can be hard.
Well, and it's not enough just to put some rainbow signs on the door and talk about being LGBT friendly. It's a way of the staff interacting, of other residents interacting, and recognizing that if approximately 10% of the general population identify as part of the LGBT community, most likely in the facility or in any group of older adults, there's going to be roughly 10% who are part of the LGBT community. And we need to be more welcoming for those who choose to out themselves.
Great, thank you.
Community actually did a little survey of all the Lower Mainland care homes and community centres to see how many felt that they had a person who identified as a member of gender and sexual minority, and the answer was none. They all said, no, we don't have any. So the chicken and the egg again, it's tempting not to provide information or resources or visible queer signage or materials because you don't have any, right? Nobody wants to admit that 10% is the going rate right now.
We have another question, just kind of related to that, in regards to trans and non-binary people in the data. But I think you answered that, Gloria, by saying that the data sample was very small, so you had to group the lesbian and women together, I think you said. So someone's just asking if there's data specifically looking at trans and non-binary people.
Sadly not. And of course, one of the main findings that we had is that we need more information and we need to tease out. We didn't have any Indigenous participants, and this definitely needs to be teased out. We did have a community board that looked at all our materials, all our interview questions, all our promotions before they went out. And we were very careful to include 2 Indigenous elders in that group of 6 community members. But when you get levels of shame and stigma, you know, you want to put old, you want to put queer, and then you want to put racialized others or Indigenous identities, it becomes very difficult for, multiply marginalized populations to speak out. And since we're nearing the end, I do want to once again acknowledge the courage of the participants who did speak out in this study, and also to acknowledge what that has meant for them. When we talk about the impact of research, I would want to add that the impact on the 9 participants has been huge, and very, very positive. You know, they are the first people in the world to have stepped up and told their stories and have their stories heard across the globe. And it's a wonderful feat. And I like to acknowledge them in every presentation that we do.
Thank you, Claire. Another question that's come in is, with respect to limitations, wondering if it would be value added to examine demographic data such as race, ethnicity.
Gloria, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, in the Canadian, the CLSA, we are looking in a variety of different ways, and we have done some analyses where, in fact, some of the other characteristics appear to outweigh a person's SOGI. And so I would refer you to the collection of articles that Claire and Jen and I have been involved with in putting together a special issue of the journal. So we have looked at some of those things, and we continue to look at other aspects of the data. But my particular interest was in answering questions, because people have always assumed that rates were higher in the LGBT community than amongst heterosexual adults, but we didn't have much in the way of Canadian data to support that contention. So now we've got some numbers.
There was another question in regards to, say, given that many LGBTQ experienced high levels of sexual abuse at a young age, which increase their vulnerability to further experiencing sexual abuse, what could be the reason for sexual abuse that doesn't show in the longitudinal studies and the findings? Is it because people may not want to disclose?
I don't know. I was not one of those. Unfortunately, I was not somebody they asked when they chose the kinds of questions to ask.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. Is the question why they were abused, or how we can tease out the significance of early abuse?
They were just saying that the sexual abuse didn't show up in the longitudinal study findings as very prevalent, I guess. And then you had mentioned, I think at the beginning, your story of Trudy, and that's indicated that some people had experienced trauma in their young childhood.
Yes, what was striking was that all 9 participants, and of course the participants were random in that they were just the people that we could find. But it seems to me, you know, we can't talk about statistical significance. I don't want Gloria on my case, you know, from extrapolating too much. But it seems to me very telling, shall we say, that all of them experienced severe early abuse. That tells me something. And I think, again, we need to find out more. We need more research. You know, we've got enough people on this Zoom to take this forward and pick some of these issues apart. They're pressing, and they need to be looked at. This work needs to happen, for sure.
Thank you, Claire. That's all the time that we have for today. I want to say thank you again to our presenters, Dr. Gloria Gutman, Dr. Claire Robson. Thank you as well to the ASL interpreters, Savannah and Alex. And thank you to EAPO, Rayanne Rideout, for also joining me today. A reminder to please complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation. A link will automatically open in your browser after the event has ended. Thank you again for joining this special event co-hosted by the Learning Network and Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.